Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Peak Human Project. Today is another episode in which I have a guest, and today my guest is Daniel Bove. Daniel happens to be a really good friend of mine that I met in grad school, and he is now the director of performance for the Phoenix Suns NBA franchise. We talk a lot about his own personal philosophies around training, what he does on a day-to-day basis as the director of performance for the Phoenix Suns, and we get into a little bit of philosophy, training, and otherwise in this podcast. And I think you guys are really going to like his take on not just training, but life in general. So without further ado, please welcome my guest, Daniel Bove.
Same time workout. I'm eating the same thing every day, which is pretty healthy. And I probably haven't been this consistent with training since regionals.
Wow. That was a long time ago.
It feels crazy.
What year was regionals for you?
2014.
2014. So it's been so you feel like 6 years later because of what's going on with everything outside. That's when you finally got it back into a groove.
Exactly.
Good though. What's your training been like this last couple months, I guess, month and a half?
I've been doing to be honest with you, true CrossFit almost. I'll wake up every day. I'll try to do something different than I did the day before. And, that's pretty much it. That's all I'm doing. It's just every day. It's today I'm going to go on a 60-minute run. And then tomorrow and then it's I come in today and I'm just going to work on hanging for an hour. I'm just going to hang with different positions. And then the next day it's I'm going to squat today. And it's just trying to change it up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's pretty cool. I think for me, it's been a little bit of the same, but I think I have a tendency during this time to not be 100% consistent every week with what I do. I've been trying not to do the same movements every week, even though that's what they, conventional wisdom would say you should, and then try to progressively overload or whatever. But I've been having fun just trying to come up with stuff I can do randomly around the house, with whatever I have.
Your band workouts are legit.
I tried to, I didn't have the pieces of wood yesterday to do RDLs, those banded RDLs. I don't know if you saw those, but yeah. So I tried using these, my landlord had some old, what do you call it? Countertops. What is that? Granite. They had some old granite slabs, just little 4 inches across or whatever. So I tried to use those, and I ended up splitting the granite in half because the band tension was too much, I guess. So that didn't work. But
MacGyver.
I've been using that. I've been using the hell out of that VersaClimber. That's for sure.
Yeah, there you go.
That was a good. I didn't use it for months. Ever since I got it, I didn't use it for months, and then all of a sudden, it's a key element of my workouts.
It's a staple.
It's a staple. It's a hell of a machine, that's for sure. It doesn't look hard.
Does it have batteries in it, or is it plugged in, or what?
It's plugged in. So I just plug it in, and it doesn't look like much, right? When you're doing, I don't know if you've used it before.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like much, but then it's kind of like the air bike, where it's you just think it's easy from the looks of it, and then you do it, and you're like, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Oh, dude, I know how that is. We still have one. We still have one at the gym. I just don't really ever use it.
Yeah. It's kind of if I had something else, if I had an assault bike or a rower like you have, I'd definitely use that instead, but it takes up a lot of space.
Yeah, it does.
Well, that's cool, man. So, let's see. There's a lot that we could talk about, obviously. You are let's just introduce you. You're Daniel Bove. You're the director of performance for the Phoenix Suns.
Yes,
is that correct?
That's currently my job. I am the director of performance for the Suns. I oversee strength and conditioning and sports science for the team.
Okay, awesome. And so I think a lot of people might, hear sports science or director of performance and they maybe have not quite an idea of what that all entails, but on a day-to-day basis, generally, what do you do day to day? Are you working with the players one-on-one? Are you more taking analytics and data and reporting back to your bosses? Like, how does that work?
So I work with a great performance staff. We have a head strength coach, Corey Schlesinger. We have assistant strength coach, Jeff Dolan, and then our sports scientist, Kohei Tamagawa. We all work as one unit. Now, on a day-to-day, they're doing most of the coaching, most of the monitoring. I'm more on the back end, kind of overseeing kind of what the day-to-day looks like, helping out with, just the general program in itself, doing a lot of back-end work with the data, setting up our data stream, the structure of the data sets, things like that. How we're reporting and communicating the information to the front office, how we're communicating it to the rest of the health and training staff, and then just kind of, talking to everyone who's involved with basketball operations and how we can improve performance. That's kind of my role right now.
Okay. So it's not so much, one-on-one training with the athletes or anything. It's more so that big picture stuff like you're talking about. So you have like your strength and conditioning coaches that are working with the players as far as working them out and things like that. And I'm sure you do some of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, currently the way that the job is kind of set up is it's more of a hands-off approach, sit back, and I let Corey and Jeff do what they do best, which is be awesome strength and conditioning coaches. So That's one of the reasons I brought them in. So I rely heavily on them to do the in the trenches coaching and training of the players. My role has kind of progressed in this way where, last year I was the director of performance, did a lot more coaching than I currently do. But when I had the chance to hire these guys and expand the staff, I was able to take a step back and, do a little bit more of the big picture stuff, which, I'm always going to miss coaching. I definitely, I will coach again, but with our current setup, this is kind of just how we're operating, which it's been extremely efficient up to this point.
That's awesome. So when it comes to working with athletes and stuff, I think that, me personally, I think I have like a preconceived idea of what that means, or like what is the difference between working with a pro athlete versus kind of people that I tend to work with, which is general population, maybe people who are trying to be, hobby athletes, right? Like powerlifting and things like that. But, what do you see as a big difference? Because you've worked with both. You worked in CrossFit. You were a strength and conditioning coach leading into this. So you've worked with both sides. Now working with athletes. What are some like big differences, if any, that you've seen in working with this kind of population?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, it's very complex. Like what makes a pro elite level athlete different from Gen Pop? And there's so many different ways you can take it, but it's obviously a little bit of nature, a little bit of nurture. But when you really break it down and you're starting to look at the elite athlete, like the best in the world at these things, you're basically, it all comes down to who their parents were and what their genetic profile is. And, as coaches, we help them find a way to express these genes over time, and their environment obviously has a play in that. How they were brought up has a play in that. But at the end of the day, these guys are just genetic freaks. They're just genetic freaks. They are, and I really didn't understand how much of a freak they were until I got to this level of sport.
Okay.
As far as like from a psychological standpoint, what I think makes these guys extremely special is I think, especially in a sport like basketball where it's very output based, you have to be explosive, you have to have endurance, but it's also very high skill. So it's not like, you have to be able to go up and down in terms of like arousal level. And I think the guys who are really special at this level, they're able to turn it completely off and then turn it completely on. When they're not playing their sport, they're super relaxed. They're laid back. At least some of the really special ones are. And then when they're playing, they're able to really raise that and become hyper-focused. And but while being hyper-focused, they're able to keep their anxiety extremely low. They're able to find flow state and be relaxed even in these like very tense situations. So it's just, they're Ferraris, man. They're Ferraris, and there's a reason why they were selected to play at the level they are.
I think probably one example I can think of where I've heard that before is in jiu-jitsu with Marcelo Garcia, where he sort of had this way of just like basically taking a nap around the mats at world championships. And like, basically you would never be able to tell that he was about to enter a championship fight or a championship match against another killer, basically. And then, being able to go from that, basically just like a 0 or a 1 on the arousal scale, to just like 10 out of 10 when he needed it. And also being able to do that without having to depend on any specific environmental triggers or anything like that, because especially in sport, I'm assuming that the environment's going to be different all the time. Like, you're going to be at a different stadium or a different arena, and you're going to have different things going on as far as maybe with basketball you've got 5 fouls, you haven't hit a shot maybe in a little while, like I don't know, all kinds of different ways that the environment's different. But to be able to turn that on despite any of those obstacles would be crazy. I wish I knew how to do that for myself,
Well, that's so funny that you bring up Marcelo Garcia. He's been a hero of mine ever since I started grappling. He was unreal to watch in his prime. But similar story is when I was at Penn State undergrad, watching Ed Ruth wrestle for Penn State. He was a close friend of mine. Was actually roommates with my best friend. I remember it was the Nittany Lion Open, which is like a mid-season open tournament where nationally ranked wrestlers from throughout the country will come and wrestle at Penn State. And Ed, I think this was when he was a sophomore or freshman, but he's in the semifinals and he's going up against some really high caliber wrestlers at that point in the tournament. And I remember the announcer at the arena just kept calling, Ed Ruth, please report to mat 5 or whatever it was. And the announcer kept repeating, Ed Ruth, please come to mat 5. And the match is supposed to have started. And here comes Ed sprinting out from under the bleachers. He was asleep. He was literally sleeping in the middle of a tournament under the bleachers at the arena, sprints out within a minute, pins his opponent.
Wow.
Doesn't even warm up, just goes to the mat, puts his headgear on, pins his guy, runs off the mat, and goes back under the bleachers and starts sleeping again.
Jesus.
It was one of the craziest things I've ever seen. But Ed was the prime example of, he was this guy who, and still is, he fights in Bellator now, MMA,
okay.
But he has this uncanny ability to turn it off and on and be relaxed when he's actually grappling. But he's one of the most explosive athletes I've ever seen on the mat. Almost like a Jordan Burroughs clone. But then his relaxation is what makes him special. So
yeah, I feel like, well, I don't know what your opinion is on it, but it's almost like if you're not really used to doing that, or you don't really have that in your nature, I feel like it's really hard to learn how to do that. Would you agree?
Yeah, and that's part of where I think the nurture comes into it, and there are certain things that are passed down genetically. It's obviously genetic, and how you were raised are going to influence your demeanor and your personality. But yeah, I think there's something special about someone who has that ability. I don't think that's common. Having worked with the athletes I've worked with, I don't see a ton of people who have that quality, and the ones that do, they stand out, and they're they're really, really good at what they do.
Because I think of like a guy like Donald Cowboy Cerrone in the UFC, where he really makes it on the outside. He makes it seem like he's relaxed, like in press conferences leading up to his fights and even before fights. He makes it seem like he's relaxed, but I've heard a lot of stories and actually heard from him speaking on it himself that on the inside he really doesn't feel that way. And so although he's sort of trying his hardest to be that relaxed person, it's like it's like he can't, no matter, I mean, he's fought more than anyone pretty much in the UFC. He fights 4 or 5 times a year, but still he can't really seem to reach that. And it must be just something that he doesn't have genetically, like you were saying, and some people just do.
Well, it's funny too, because it's like, it's just how you're perceiving the stress and situation and not letting it overtake your entire being, right? Like, I think I remember George St. Pierre talking about how, you know, being a little bit scared and a little bit anxious is really good. It keeps you sharp. If you're not anxious a little bit, or maybe even a little bit fearful of what's going to happen, or you're nervous, if you're not nervous, then you're not going to be as sharp as you probably should be. But you can't let it get to a point where you start to let it affect your performance. So it's that fine line between like letting a little bit in, but not letting it overtake you.
Do you find that, so I know that part of your job is keeping track of like wellness and all that stuff for the players. Do you find that there is anything that can affect those guys that are able to do that really well and turn it on and turn it off? Have you found any correlation between things that are going on in their life or training load or anything that can affect their ability to do that?
I think the biggest, this is kind of silly, but when you work with these guys, they know themselves so well. They might not be able to explain it all the time, but they tend to know what they want and need before competition. So you have 3 or 4 guys that, you know, they know that they need to actually bump their arousal level up to get prepped for a game. So these kind of guys, they're your caffeine people, right? They're going to want their Red Bulls. They're going to want their no-dos. There's different caffeine supplements out there, but, you know, players who need that bump, they know they need that bump, and they're going to seek it out. And then you have the other guys that, they're going to probably try to meditate before a game, or they're going to relax more, or they're going to play video games, or they're just going to do something that takes their mind off of it. So I think when you get to this level and you have the experience that these guys have, when it comes to competition and getting them prepped mentally for competition, as a practitioner, I think we kind of step back and we let them kind of run the show from that perspective. And then we're there to support if they need something, or they want advice on how to prep a specific way, then we will offer it. But, you know, when it comes to competing, that's where we get out of the way, and we let them, you know, dictate what is going to get them right for competition.
It's interesting. I know that, I work with people virtually, right? So I don't work with people in person like you do. But one thing that I've noticed, I guess, so it's interesting you bring that sort of that's your approach with a lot of guys, letting them figure out what's best for themselves and kind of, I guess, letting them self-customize or fine-tune what they need. And I see a lot of the same thing when I'm coaching people and the way that they work out and stuff is a lot of times they'll want me to like basically detail every little thing that they should be doing in the gym, exactly how they should be contracting their muscle this way and blah, blah, blah. And I've had to kind of walk them back and say, like, you know what, I can't really tell you exactly what's going to work for you, in the sense that you're going to have to, like, I'm going to be able to write you something that is 90% customized, and that last 10% is your job. You know what I mean? Because ultimately, you know, if I tell somebody, hey, you know what, before you go and hit your 1 rep max attempt, I need you to like slap yourself in the face and do something crazy like that. Well, some people aren't going to respond well to that. Some people need the opposite. And so it's interesting because I feel like early on, you feel like you want to, that if you don't tell somebody exactly what they need to do, they're going to think that you don't know what you're doing, maybe, or they're going to look at you like you're not a wealth of information or something like that. But I feel that giving them that freedom is actually better than the alternative.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
So working in the NBA, what are some, I mean, you've been working in the NBA now for how many years?
Going on, so this is finishing up my fourth year.
And so I know that like you growing up, like you were a big basketball fan, right?
Oh yeah. I mean,
big time.
I'm from Philadelphia, and as Andres, you know, because we went to grad school together and we became really close. I was the biggest Philadelphia 76ers fan growing up. And like, I mean, that was my sport, like my favorite sport, favorite thing to do was, I remember my grandma was a huge NBA fan, and her favorite player was Allen Iverson. But I remember we didn't have cable growing up, so my dad and I would drive 15 minutes to my grandmom's house, pretty much every game, and we would just watch the game with her. But so very early on, I was pretty much hooked on NBA basketball.
And so, like, obviously when you're a kid, you grow up and you're dreaming about being in the NBA, playing in the NBA, and you're in the NBA, you're not playing, but you got about as close as you could, I guess. And what's been surprising for you about being in the NBA or working in the NBA that even maybe going into the job 4 years ago that you wouldn't have expected that you can share with us?
I would say on a personal level, I didn't really understand or fathom how much travel can actually affect you on like a physical and a psychological level. From a fan's perspective, these guys are traveling all the time, but you don't, unless you experience it, you don't really understand like how difficult it can be, and how sporadic it is, and how hard it is on your family life, and how hard it is to try to find that balance. So that's been a huge part in my growth as a person, trying to find balance with work and home, and traveling to different time zones all the time, and making sure that I'm keeping the most consistent sleep schedule that I can for myself. So that was something that I wasn't prepped for when I came in, but it's definitely made me stronger and better as a person. I think from the athlete standpoint, I think realizing how much time these guys are spending outside of basketball related to their job. So it's like these guys aren't just playing basketball. They're doing, they come in the morning, they have their individualized workout with their skill coach. They have team practice, they have team lifts, they have their treatment if they need it. They have team sponsored events they have to attend. They have, their community work that they do, fan interaction stuff. It's a long day for these guys, and there's a million people that are fighting for their time. So it's one of the reasons why, as a performance professional, we're trying our best to trim the fat in regards to like what these guys need from a training perspective, making sure that you're not getting an hour and a half with these guys every day. You might get 45 minutes with them. So finding the most efficient use of your time with these guys first of all, it's made us better as practitioners because we're getting rid of the stuff we don't need. But it's something that I don't think I realized before I got into the NBA, how full these guys' days are.
So you're saying that when it comes to juggling everything else that they have in life, all the stressors, getting enough sleep, all of the, having to do press and team functions and stuff, that like sometimes the workout itself, maybe especially during the season, has to be, kept to a minimum effective dosage, right? Not necessarily like wasting time in the gym or giving them more to do. It's like maybe finding what can we take away and still make this effective for them. Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, anyone who's listening, who's familiar with training at all, like, it's going to change depending on the time of year, right? So it's like off season, the way that looks is going to be different than what in season looks like, or even the ramp up during training camp is going to look different than what in season looks like in regards to the stress that we're placing on the athlete. So, yeah, I mean, it's minimal effective dose. These guys they're not weightlifters. They're not, you don't need to get them in the gym for an hour and a half to 2 hours a day. We're getting them what they need to perform at their best on the court. And they're having, an NBA schedule is just over 3 games on average per week. So the last thing you want to do is put them in a hole during the season, but you definitely want to keep them maintaining their levels of strength, help them be a little bit more resilient to injury. And then when you get into the off season, that's when you can really push these guys and start to overreach them and hopefully push some adaptations that you can't really get when you're in the middle of, fighting for a playoff spot.
Yeah. Do you feel that, I guess going back to when you were just a CrossFit coach, or even maybe before working in the NBA, maybe you were helping some people out with their training programs and things like that. Like how do you think that could be applied to those who might be listening who aren't professional athletes or training professional athletes, with just general population people? Do you feel that all of that same stuff comes into play as far as, adjusting your training based on what's going on in your life, or how much stress you have, or sleep, and all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think it depends on, to get an adaptation, you're going to have to overreach to some extent. There's different ways to do that. You can overreach with low volume, high frequency training. You can go through blocks, block periodization with your accumulation phases, your tapering, there's so many different ways that you can go about reaching an athletic goal. And I don't know if this is along the lines of your question, but I do think there's a difference between how you train for high level sport and then how you train for fitness, health, and longevity. Like, they're just two different ends of the spectrum. And I think I've heard James Fitzgerald of OPEX talk about this several times, where if you put them on a continuum and you look at the blood profiles of a high-end athlete, especially the grueling sports like the CrossFits, the ultramarathoning, these really grueling ones, and then you look at people who are training for health, wellness, and fitness. Like, if I look under the hood at someone who's a high-level CrossFitter, their blood profile is probably closer to that of disease and sickness than it is health and longevity, right? So it's, high-level sport is asymmetrical in nature. It's going to be unbalanced. That's just how it is. Like, anything done to an extreme is inherently not going to be healthy.
Right.
So, but that's just the name of the game. You gotta, if you want to find health and longevity, it's got to be a little bit more balanced. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just kind of how I view the continuum of people who want to be healthy and fit versus people who want to compete at a high level.
Got it. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that, you have a lot you have personal experience because you were a CrossFit Games competitor on the team side, correct? And
yeah, so I was a part of CrossFit Center City in Philadelphia. We went to the Mid-Atlantic Regionals as a team that year. It was an awesome experience. Definitely one of the hardest things that I've been through from like an athletic standpoint. Learned a lot about myself, learned a lot about training, learned a lot about recovery and all of the above. But yeah, that was 2014.
Yeah. So that was like not too long before we met, actually, because I met you in 2015 when I went to grad school. Right. So, and I think, dude, we talked about that back then and how almost like after those CrossFit Games, like it was hard for you to kind of recover physically for a little bit there, right? From that whole ordeal.
Yeah. I feel like for me, I don't know how. So I haven't really followed how the competitive CrossFit is set up now, but I remember back then it was kind of like, you had your 5 open workouts, and then you had a couple months go by, and then you had regionals if you qualified for regionals, and then the games would be a month or 2 later than that. I remember, I was still learning about like peaking as an athlete and, timing that peak up properly. And I peaked a little early. I peaked during the open, mainly because I needed to, because like our team wasn't, we had to try to qualify for regionals. So we wanted to peak during the open so we could qualify for regionals, knowing that we probably weren't going to get out of regionals and go to the games. Out of 30 teams, I think we were probably close to top 10. But you had to be top 3 to actually make it. So I peaked in the open, which was months before regionals. So by the time I got to regionals, I was just completely
spent.
I was spent. And, you're lean, you're extremely lean for a long time. Everyone responds differently to that. And that more than anyone, having worked with bodybuilders and fitness competitors. And I don't respond really well to being lean for an extreme amount of time. And, it affected my sleep. It affected my mood. It affected just my interactions with people for a good year, probably at least a year or 2 following the regionals. But, I learned a lot about myself and how I recover and what type of training works well for me. And, it was an awesome experience. And, I'm happy that I got to experience it.
And those guys, in your case, like you were lean, but also performing at a really high level. Not to say that bodybuilders and physique competitors don't perform at a high level, but it's a different kind of energy system that they're using, because it's not like they're doing metcons, right? They're lifting weights. They're maybe doing some steady state cardio or some high intensity interval training or something like that to try to get leaner. But there's a difference between that and the kind of workouts that you have to do to try to be a CrossFit competitor, right? You're like burning the candle at both ends, so to speak, because you're already lean and you're subjecting yourself to really metabolically taxing and demanding workouts that are hard to recover from, even if you are at a higher body fat.
For sure. And I looking back, I definitely did not have the aerobic system that I needed to be able to recover from workout to workout. I was much more of, and still am, more of an explosive type 2, like, go out, be real anaerobic for a real short amount of time. And then I spend it all, right? And I hang on for dear life. So if it's a workout that, for instance, like Fran was a great workout for me because you could get it done in 2.5 minutes, right? I would burn it all really quick. I wasn't great at pacing, and I wasn't great at recovering from workout to workout because I was so anaerobically driven, and it was all just an energy dump for me. So things like regionals, where you have 7 or 8 workouts in a 3-day period, it was very difficult. So, in hindsight, I would probably have spent a year or 2 developing my aerobic system a little bit better before I actually went and did something like that. But it's just, you live and learn.
Yeah, that's true. Like we've talked about James Fitzgerald a lot over the years, and I think I remember him talking about, I think this is where he got his whole concept of how high level fitness and sickness are very closely related in terms of what you look like underneath the hood, like you were saying. Because I think he has personal experience. I think he won the first CrossFit Games, and then he tried to compete again a few years later, and he couldn't finish, I don't believe, because he had worked himself into a place where, I think he was having some kidney issues and some just general bodily functions were shutting down. And it took him, I think he said, maybe a year to recover from that, from whatever was going on with him. It's not like he had a disease. Nothing was physically diagnosable for what he was going through, but his body was certainly shutting down from having pushed himself just way too far. And I think that it's interesting to bring those points up, because a lot of people will see CrossFit Games competitors or see people who are at their leanest and just assume that that's the healthiest way to, like, they look very healthy, right? Because they're low in body fat and they're performing well. And maybe you'll start to feel bad about themselves because, I know I've done that. Like I see guys on CrossFit Games, Rich Froning. I remember when I was seeing the CrossFit Games for the first time and I saw Rich Froning, I thought, like, that's who I want to look like. That guy's like the picture of health, right? He's jacked and he's doing these crazy workouts. But then you get to find out that, like, that's not sustainable, right? You can't do it. Even like NBA players are in the prime of the season. They're at their looking their best, but I bet in the summer or in the off season, they have to let themselves kind of detrain, right? They have to let themselves get out of shape. And it's necessary for them to do that in order to then perform again the next season. Because if they don't, it's going to be a short career for them, I'm assuming.
Yeah. And, to touch on the fitness side of things, again, we just don't know what the long-term ramifications of high-level fitness are from a competitive standpoint. Like, we don't know what the lifespan of these guys are going to be. And I'm not saying it's going to be good or bad, but we just don't know enough about how it affects you long term. But yeah, I know a ton of stories from close friends of mine who've competed at the games level as individual athletes who their bodies are, they haven't done CrossFit in 3 or 4 years and their bodies are still recovering to this day. Dang. Some of them struggle with autoimmune disorders that they believe were 100% related to how hard they were training and the unbelievable stress they were putting their bodies through.
Yeah.
You probably know 1 or 2 of them who I'm familiar with, who I'm friends with. That to this day, their health is still suffering because of the hole that they dug for themselves.
It's crazy because you get into it we all get into fitness and working out with the right intentions. Like, we're just trying to be healthy, or maybe some aesthetic goals, like just look better, feel better, things like that. And you kind of get, I guess, quote unquote, addicted. Some people get quote unquote addicted to fitness and just striving for better and all that. And you don't even know that it could lead to something like that because exercise is healthy, right? But the dose is important. The devil's in the details, so to speak.
Exactly.
And so, like, for you personally, obviously you've had that background. When we were in grad school, like, you were trying all kinds of different things, doing rowing, and I think you were doing some swimming stuff. I think you were just using yourself as a test subject to figure out, like, different ways to periodize training and programming and things like that. And so with all that in mind, like, you've had a lot of hobbies athletically and things like that. What now? Because I don't even know. I don't think I've asked you this question before, but what is your training like now? What have you found that works best for you to keep you feeling healthy and feeling confident about the way you perform, I guess?
Well, right now, things definitely changed a little bit when I became a father, and working in the NBA and having a child is, it is a challenge. And especially when you throw in, like, okay, when do I fit my workouts in? But you can still do it. I think rather than pushing for like a 600-pound deadlift or a sub 6 minute 50-second row, 2K row, like these things that I tried to do in the past, like, that's probably not happening right now. And right now it's more about maintaining my health and wellness and, dialing in my diet, still, eating good foods, good quality sourced food. But then, we have a home gym here. So I tend to, keep my workouts between 30 and 40 minutes each day. It's funny. I'm not going out and doing CrossFit every day. I'm probably doing closer to what CrossFit was when I started, 8 or 9 years ago, where it was more just constantly varied activity on a day-to-day, but you're not really putting yourself in a hole per se. One day I might go out for a run for 30 minutes. The next day I'll jump on the rower, do some intervals, and the next day I might hang from a bar single hand and double hand with a weighted vest on and see how much time I can accumulate. And just doing different things on a day-to-day basis to keep me feeling good. That's kind of where I'm at right now, is just about feeling good, staying somewhat fit. And then, I do know when my schedule eases up a little bit and I'm ready to pursue some other athletic goals, I'll be ready to do so. But right now it's more about maintaining.
So does that, I think people fall into two different camps, and there's the people who like to do different stuff every day, which it sounds like you kind of fall into, just coming up with something on the spot maybe, or maybe you plan it out ahead of time. I don't know. And then there's the people who get more out of having that structure of maybe a consistent workout that they do for a few weeks. What do you feel like? I think there's probably naysayers on both sides, right? There's people who will say that if you do something different every day, you're never actually pushing anything in one direction. And then you say, well, if you do the same workout, several weeks in a row, you're neglecting a lot of different attributes that you could be working on if you did something different every day. What would you say, is your preferred way? And what would you say to the naysayers or the detractors of the way you like to do things?
Well, I think right now, it's when I wake up in the morning, my number one goal isn't to lift 600 pounds from the ground. It's not, I don't have specific athletic goals per se at the current moment. And I want to feel good, and I like physical activity. So my workout doesn't have to be a gym workout. I'll go hiking with my family. We'll hike for an hour and a half, 2 hours here in Arizona, which there's beautiful hikes out here. The weather's amazing. That's my workout for the day. I'm not at a point right now where I'm pushing anything specific, but I will say that if there were something specific that I was trying to go for, that's where I think periodization and really getting down and structuring your training, it's the best way to do it. And you have to do it if you want to achieve your goals. At least anything worthwhile, you're probably going to have to follow a program. I would say just right now, it's just not where I currently am in my life. But, I still track what I do. So I'm still competitive with myself. So if I am doing some 1Ks, right? Say I'm doing 3 or 4 1K rows on the rower, I'm tracking that. I'm tracking my rest time. I'm tracking my performance. I'm tracking when I do squat, I'm tracking what my sets and reps were, what weight I used, so that the next time I go about it, I'm able to do something similar or maybe even a little bit better, and you get better that way too. But that's kind of where I fall. Hopefully that answers your question.
That's perfect. I'll tell you what, I wish I had the home gym right now, because with everything going on with the COVID-19, I've just been making up random crap with stuff I have around the house. So I wish I had that home gym that you have, but that's a good way to do things. I think it sounds like you're kind of you found a way to hybridize it, where right now there's nothing you have that's pressing as far as athletic goals, but you're keeping track of things so that, you make sure you're not regressing, hopefully, in any one area. Hopefully you're progressing. And if at the very least matching some of your previous performances, so that way when it is time, when maybe you have more time with your job, or you have more time with your family duties and things like that, hey, if you want to go hit the 600-pound deadlift, you have all of this data on how you perform just with a base training, right? And then B, you just get yourself into a program that's a little bit more specific and periodized for that goal.
Yeah, and I think anyone who has ever been competitive, either in actual sport competition or even with themselves, you're going to have numbers that you're not going to want to lose, right? So I'm always, no matter what I'm doing, right now, I need to always be able to deadlift 500 pounds. It's I always have to be able to squat 405. I got to be able to run a 7-minute mile. I have to be able to do this and do that. And like, there's certain things that you keep tabs on, and you don't want to lose that quality, right? Now, it's not like I'm sitting down and periodizing to be able to do those things, but, just by like kind of self-checking and, okay, maybe a month from now, I'm going to test my deadlift. And if it is going below 500 pounds, then that's when it's time to start deadlifting a little bit more. But, you just keep your checks and balances. And if you know yourself and your body and how you're performing and how you're feeling, and you can keep tabs on yourself pretty well. And I think everyone keeps a mental checklist of kind of where they're gaining and losing.
You find you're a real competitive person?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So how have you been able to like satisfy that part of your nature without being able to push yourself right now physically? Is it mentally? Do you have some mental things, some educational things that you're being competitive with yourself with? Is it your job? Trying to be the best you can be there? What, being a dad, being the best kind of dad you could be? What I guess satisfies that competitive nature in you right now?
It's a really good question. So I think right now my focus is on being the best dad that I can be, as well as at work, being in a leadership position where I have to make sure that as a performance department, we are doing the best job that we can, and that we're pushing the envelope and, doing really good work. Those are new things in my last couple of years of life. So it's, I've shifted a little bit away from the athletic area of my personal athleticism and focusing more professionally and, as a father. So that's kind of, I think when it comes to being competitive, obviously, like, you can't compete with saying, hey, I'm a better dad than you. Like, that's not really what I'm focusing on right now. Like, but as far as being the best performance department, I do think we do a really good job, and we're constantly trying to do better than our opponents. Now, you can't always measure that. Like, I don't know what this team's doing and this team's doing, but I do know that we're trying to be the best in the NBA on a day-to-day basis. And whether that, I think with my staff in particular, if you were to talk to everyone on my staff, I think the one commonality between everybody is they're all curious, they're all competitive, and you see that because they're always trying to learn a new skill or get better at a specific area. They're not complacent. And I think we all are competitive. And, when Jeff Dolan, one of our strength coaches, when he takes a course and then he comes back in, he starts talking to us about the course, we immediately ears perk up and we're like, oh, I want to go take that course too. I want to learn what he's learning. Yeah. And it works the other way too. I know I'll do something and then Jeff will come in and be like, oh, I want to do that too. And it's a great environment. We're always pushing each other and we're competitive with ourselves, but it's like a positive, like healthy competition. I think the same thing goes for skill sets too. I know the people that I know in the NBA who are applied sports scientists or director of performance people, or, even in an analytics position with specific teams, if you're friends with those type of people and you keep a strong relationship with them, I think if you are competitive, you're always keeping tabs on what other people are doing and you're trying to add things to your skill set. So if someone's learning a specific coding language that's going to help you do your job as a director of performance, like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go learn that. So you're learning that, I'm going to go learn that too. And I'm going to learn how to apply it to what I do. So I think, my competitive nature is I have competition with learning skills as much as I have with becoming really strong or fast or explosive. Yeah.
I think that that's really cool that you shared that, because I think a lot of people are often wondering, like, what are some traits that I need to practice or hone in myself to be better in general at my job or what I do in the gym or anything like that. And definitely, I agree. I think that when I look at people like yourself or obviously I know Jeff Dolan as well, because we went to grad school together, all three of us. But I think that constant hunger and drive to continue learning, and curiosity is super important. And I also think that it can be tempting to let that go too far at times, if you know what I mean. So it can almost be hard. It's like a double-edged sword, right? Because it could be hard for you to turn that off, that drive to finish this project, that drive to learn this next lesson, that when you turn off the computer or you put down the book, like to stop your brain from continuing to think about that throughout the rest of the night. I know that happens to me. And do you have any tricks or tips for people who might struggle with that, with, hey, I really need to figure out a way to turn that off now because it's time to be with the family, or it's time to do X, Y, and Z, that it doesn't have anything to do with that thing that I'm trying to learn?
Man, this is such a deep conversation to have. Like, there's so many different ways you can take this, but like it goes kind of back to what we were talking about before with like how anything done to an extreme is not going to be the healthiest thing for you as a person. And that doesn't just relate to sport. That relates to, being addicted to something like coding per se, or, whatever it is. Like, if you do something to an extreme, it's probably going to affect you in other areas of your life. So I think having a really good why as to like, why did you choose to go into the career that you went into? Like, I know I have to ask myself all the time, because like you said, I get addicted to certain endeavors, and if you let yourself drift too far off the path, you forget like why you got into this in the first place. Mm-hmm. So like always, I think, be as often as you can, try to remind yourself of why you're doing what you're doing. And, something that keeps me grounded and, keeps me from getting as addicted as I used to get to certain endeavors, and as full steam ahead as I used to get, is just having a family, having a wife and a son who I can come home to, spend time with, takes my mind off of some of the stresses with work or some of the other endeavors that I'm aiming for. I think that adds a balance to your life that it's extremely healthy. At least in my life, it's been a great influence on me and has provided a little bit of balance for myself.
I remember in grad school, it was your last year there, this online class we had, science, I forgot what it was called, Sport and Society, something like that. Sport and Society. You finished the class. It was an online class. All the lessons were available from the very beginning, and you finished the class in like a week, or even less than a week, I think, right?
I think it was 72 hours.
Yeah, that's okay. So I even underestimated you. 3 days to finish a whole semester's worth of information. I remember you telling me after that you felt like your brain needed a deload. Like you had done so much in such a little amount of time that you like broke your brain for a couple of days. It needed to just do nothing for a couple of days.
I vividly remember that. And I remember because I was in that class with you and Dolan, I think. And yeah, I do remember that. And the main reason I did that was because it was my last semester and I was working at a CrossFit gym in Tampa. And the only way I was going to be able to make that work is if I had a lighter class load. So I basically just, for 72 hours, I didn't sleep. I just went full force on this online class. And I'm glad that I did it, but I definitely, like your body, it's like you push your mind to a certain point, and I do think it needs to recover. I'm the same way with podcasts too, and I think I've opened up to you about that, where if I will get addicted to listening to podcasts, and I'll get addicted to reading books, and I need deloads. Maybe it's kind of it's a microcosm of what I talked about earlier with kind of wishing I had a better aerobic base in CrossFit, where I was able to be a little bit more sustainable. I think that's something that as a person I need to get better at. But yeah, no, when I push myself mentally, I definitely need time to recover. And maybe that's why I jump around to so many different hobbies and endeavors all the time, just because I need to recover, because I go so hard on one thing and then it's like, okay, now take a break and go hard on something else and then come back to the thing that I was going hard on before. you know, going off on a tangent here, but that's just kind of how I am as a person.
No, I like it. I think that's interesting that you see that in yourself, like even in your, even intellectually or in your learning, that you have this tendency to burn really hot, really fast, and that like you maybe need, you've had to work on figuring out how to not come out of the gates so fast and like spread out that learning and spread out that enthusiasm as opposed to just like overwhelming yourself too fast with everything that you're doing.
To quote James Fitzgerald again, reward the pacer.
Reward the pacer. Yeah. So I want to get into a little bit more of like your books and like what you go to for intellectual inspiration, I guess. But I want to pull it back really quick to this whole athlete thing. And a lot of times coaches these days, I've done it myself, they'll refer to their like Gen Pop people as athletes. And I've seen some people kind of be upset about that because maybe, you know, it's using that term kind of liberally. But I'd like your opinion on, having worked with athletes, having worked with general population people, where do you fall on that? Do you feel that it's fair to I'll just use myself as an example. Is it fair for me to refer to myself as an athlete when what I do physically is really more of a hobby and like a lifestyle thing, as opposed to what an NBA athlete or an NFL athlete has to go through, where that's their job and literally their whole day is dedicated to their athleticism in some form or fashion?
Really good question. I think if you are in an athletic domain with whatever you're doing, if it's an athletic feat that you're attempting and you're competing with yourself or others, I think you can consider yourself an athlete. Now, professional athlete versus amateur versus like weekend warrior, like they only differ by degree. You know what I mean? So I guess it is subjective, right? It's subjective how you discern athlete versus non-athlete. But I would say if you're in an athletic domain and you're competing with yourself or someone else, I don't see what the problem is with calling you an athlete. Anyone who gets mad at you for calling yourself an athlete, like, I don't know, there's probably something wrong with them, or they've got something more deeper that they're figuring out. Yeah,
I agree with you. I've always found it interesting that people get so upset about it. Because like I mean, it just seems like you're trying to find something to get angry about. You're
arguing semantics.
Right. Well, so that makes me feel better because I think all of us aspire as little kids to be athletes in some way or another. Most of us do, at least. We see our idols on TV and stuff. And so I think it makes me feel better that I can call myself an athlete and not feel like I'm an imposter.
No, you're an athlete.
Even like, I'll say like comparing myself to some of the stuff you've been able to do in your athletic career, even with that, I'm like, well, yeah, I don't compare to Danny. I call you Danny, obviously, but your official name is Daniel.
Well, so. My official name is Daniel. Everyone at work calls me Bove. Okay. But then anyone who's like really close with me outside of, work or school has always called me Danny. So
yeah. I've yet to have
when Krista, my wife, will come into work sometime, or she's at a game every now and then, and she'll call me Danny to people who I work with, and they kind of have to double take, like, who the hell is Danny?
Yeah. I think I did that too when I went to a game, and if you run into people who are part of the team, they're like, oh, who do you know? Like, I'm like, oh, I know Danny. And they look at me like, Bove? I'm like, oh, yeah, Bove.
Yeah.
It's funny how that happens. So I know one thing that you've always, going back to like intellectual stuff and books specifically, one area that you've sort of inspired me on and pushed me a bit on personally is sort of the content that you like to read that's not even fitness related, that can probably be applied pretty well to anything. But like you've gotten into or gotten me into books like Anti-Fragile. You've gotten me into listening to guys like Naval Ravikant. So like Nicholas Taleb wrote Anti-Fragile, and he has this whole like black swan theory and all that kind of stuff. It's very interesting stuff. And you're really, like, when I hear you talk about things, I think you really bring that methodology into the way even you operate as a coach and operate as a person. But how have you incorporated those philosophies? First off, could you kind of expand a little bit on what those teachings are, and maybe generally what they mean to you, and then how you have applied those to your job and your life and so on?
Well, I think first thing, the reason that I've sought these type of books out is, I remember when I first got into the MBA, when you come out of college and you come out of grad school, like, you're so gung-ho on reading like peer-reviewed literature and, books on training and these things that apply directly to being a physical preparation professional. You need that base. Like, don't get me wrong. That's something you need to have at the base of your pyramid before you start growing in who you are going to be as a professional. But I remember Art Horn, when I was with the Atlanta Hawks, told me, the answers to the questions that you're trying to figure out in your field are probably not going to be found in your field. You're probably going to have to go out, find inspiration from other areas that have already solved these problems, bring in that as inspiration to solve it within your domain. So that kind of set me off on, seeking out other types of books and stuff to read. But yeah, I mean, Nassim Taleb, his book Anti-Fragile was a big one for me when I was getting started in the MBA. And just the MBA is a chaotic environment. It's very uncertain on the day to day, and I think Anti-Fragile is a great book for making how to make decisions in an uncertain environment or when there is chaos. Like, what are some things you can hang your hat on? And then, to go further with like deciding what literature to read, there's something that Nassim Taleb talks about called the Linde Effect. And it's a way of describing the robustness of an item or book or whatever it is. It's proportional to its lifespan that's already happened. So it's like, if a book has been popular and relevant for 50 years, according to Nassim Taleb's probability, it's probably going to be relevant for another 50 years. Okay. But then if it's a 50-year relevant book and then it's relevant for 10 years more and it's 60, then it's going to have the lifespan of 120. So, applying these principles to not only, the literature that I read, but it's like the food you eat and the things that you consume. It's like, are these new things that are kind of a flash in the pan that you're adding to your life, or are these things that have withstood the test of time, essentially? So I think Taleb has really opened up my mind to like what I consume on a daily basis, if that makes sense. I think another thing that he talks a lot about that I think resonates with me and anyone who's in this field, or pretty much any field, but the concept of skin in the game and, only really trusting decisions and from decision makers who are sharing risk, right? So, in my field, I want to take advice from practitioners who have had success or failures in an applied setting, right? So and this isn't a shot at people in academia, because you need research and you need academia. But, if you haven't stepped foot out of academia and you expect me to take your advice, 100% of your advice and use it on a daily basis, like, I'm probably not going to do that. I'm going to listen to you when it comes to things like hard science and statistics. But as far as how I apply research and, sports science, how I apply it in the day-to-day, I want to talk to someone who's done it and who's had success with it in that environment, So I think listening to people who have skin in the game is an important thing. And I think another thing Nassim Taleb has touched on is people without skin in the game, they tend to make things a little bit more complex than they need to be because they're motivated for perception and as opposed to being motivated for results. So, full disclosure, like I think when you're in sports science, you can easily fall into that trap because you're dealing with data, you're dealing with models, you're putting out graphics, you're doing these things that look really fancy and intellectual to people. I think you need to test yourself and make sure you push yourself as a practitioner to not fall into the trap of wanting things to look fancy and be perceived a certain way if you're not getting results. Like I think sometimes we put the cart in front of the horse and you're motivated by perception. I'm guilty of it. There's been times in my 4 years in the NBA where people will compliment something I'm doing and it'll feel great in the moment, but then later you're like, you know what, did that actually add anything to us winning games or making these guys better athletes? I think because if it didn't, I don't want people complimenting me on work that didn't lead to a direct transfer of training or improvement in performance, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
So I think, I just went off on a long tangent on Nassim Taleb, but I think there's a ton of stuff that you can learn from some of his books, and Anti-Fragile and Skin in the Game are two of the best ones that I've read. As far as you touched on Naval Ravikant, I found out who Naval was. He had a tweet storm a year or two ago where he just went off on a tangent regarding, he called it How to Get Rich tweet storm. And it really wasn't about how to get rich in terms of money. It was more so about how you enrich your life. And he talks about, the people who study business or they want to read about business, there's no such thing as like a business skill. Like the only way that you're going to be able to learn business is by starting a business. As you probably know, you learn more about starting your own business and going out and making mistakes and having successes than you did reading about it in a book. Right. So it's like, I apply that while I'm not really a businessman, like I apply that to what I do. It's like you only really learn by doing. At least anything worthwhile you need to actually do rather than just read about doing. So those are some things I've taken from those two people that you mentioned.
I think one area that recently that I have seen that what you're saying about actually being the best way, and in a completely unrelated field would be I've been trying to hone my Spanish skills because I have a plan to go to live in Mexico City for a few months. And there's all the reading you can do in Spanish. There's all of the apps you can download that can help to teach you Spanish. But until you actually start conversing with people in Spanish, you're very limited. It's that conversation, and it's that making mistakes in conversation, being corrected in conversation, and honing your skills that way where you really become proficient at Spanish or any language for that matter. And so the same thing, I think that almost to me illustrates the difference between somebody who's just a researcher, somebody who knows the theory and all that kind of stuff really well versus the person who is in the trenches actually doing the work, right? They can then, hopefully if they have the scientific aptitude to read the research that's being put out, can take the research and say, you know what, this is great in theory, but in practice, this isn't going to work really well. And also being able to identify, actually, this is great in theory and it works really well in practice.
And you need both sides. You need both, right? So it's
right. To quote our buddy Jeff Dolan, I think he says all the time, it'd be way better if more researchers were coaches and more coaches got into research, right?
I agree with that. That's a good way to think about it.
Going back to the book, so Anti-Fragile, Skin in the Game, those are two really good books that you would recommend. If you had to pick a third book, what would be the third book that you would recommend people read, whether it be in the strength and conditioning field or not?
Oof. Well, I guess since this is kind of like a training/fitness podcast, I'll throw out like my favorite training related book that I've probably read, and that's Super Training by
Okay.
Krokoshansky. I remember when I was a sophomore or junior in college, and I was just transitioning to the kinesiology program because I was coming from being a fine art major, jumping to kinesiology, and I was starting to finally like figure out that you can make a career of being a coach. And I remember the Penn State Public Library, they had super training as a book there, and people at my CrossFit gym were telling me like, oh, you got to read this book. These were people who'd been in the industry for 10 years already, and they were telling me, oh, you got to read Super Training. So, I kept trying to get it from the Penn State Library, and it was always on hold. Like there was other people reading it. I had to wait. I remember I had to wait like 3 or 4 months before I was actually able to get the book and read it. And as soon as I got it, I opened it, and I was blown away at how complex and
Kind of a difficult read, yeah?
It was a difficult read, and I was surprised. I was like, this isn't what I thought. I didn't think strength and conditioning was that in-depth, right? So it really opened my eyes to the world of physical preparation and periodization and overload and all these things that I think laid the foundation for me as a coach. And I'm really glad that was one of the first books I ever read on training, because it just set a really good foundation for me and really good theory on how to look at the training process. But it's also one of those books that has withstood the test of time. Been around for a few decades now, and it's one that I highly recommend for anyone starting out in space.
As somebody, going back to what you said earlier about things that stand the test of time, and you just mentioned it again, how do you evaluate new things that come onto the market, or new ideas, new concepts that come into the sports science realm? How do you evaluate those? Because obviously you want to have a mix of tried and true methods and also bringing in some new novel things that might work really well or improve upon what you're already doing. How do you evaluate those things and filter those things for yourself in practice?
That's a really good question. And it's actually something that I struggle with on a daily basis. Like I don't always have the answer to like what's worthwhile and what's not. I do think it's a constant growth and a constant, you're always trying to make better decisions. Like, the decisions I make when I'm 31, I'm hoping those are better decisions than the decisions I made when I was 30. Right. So it's like, I hear what you're saying. It's like, well, then how do you ever test new things if the only things you ever do are older things? And I think for me, what I try to do is connect dots with things that have worked really well throughout the years that resemble things that are newer, or if people I know I'm really close with who have tried certain things that are newer, that I respect their opinion, I will try something. But then also just being a guinea pig and testing things out because something, you just have an intuition that it's probably, and here's the thing, if you have skin in the game, you tend to have a pretty good bullshit detector, at least as it applies to your domain, right? Mm-hmm. So I do think the more experience you gain, and I'm not saying I'm the most experienced dude, I'm 30 years old. So there's people who've been in this a lot longer than me who are way better decision makers than I am. But I do think with experience, your bullshit detector gets a little bit better, and you're able to see what applies and what connects and what is really relevant to what you're trying to do.
Okay. And so it's almost like you keep your foundations grounded in things that are tried and true and that have worked for a long time and probably are going to continue working, but perhaps you'll start adding some new things. You'll start trying out some new things, comparing that to your gold standard, maybe sort of the same way they do in research, comparing new things to the gold standard. And if you find that it's helpful, you keep it. And if not, then just get rid of it. Itself isn't necessarily something 100%. That's been around for a long time. And so maybe with the limited data or the limited knowledge that's been accumulated so far, like what are those maybe hallmark things that you like to look at personally that you have relied upon the most and maybe you hang your hat on the most in your job or in your field?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone starting out, when you're building a model, a performance model, whether it's for other athletes or for yourself, I think, you have to establish what your big rocks are. And then, like I was alluding to earlier in the talk, is, try to make things simple first, and you can build from simplicity, right? So I think when it comes to my big rocks, I think they are probably training load, training response, which, training response is going to be, a physiological or psychological effect that training elicits, right? So also nutrition, that's another big rock of mine, sleep, and really just monitoring your KPIs and your performance. Those are my top 5. So when I go back to training load, I think my big rocks within that, so the subsets underneath would be, total time, right? So like GPS, you go into sports and every team has a catapult or a Kinexon or whatever it is. And, we use indoor GPS or LPS as they call it, but like I could do it without it. I'm fine with a stopwatch recording how long people are on the court or how long people are in the weight room, and then getting an RPE from them, a 1 to 10 score on how they perceived the exertion that took place. So for me, training load, that gets 99.9% of the benefit that I need in terms of monitoring.
So it's not very complicated then. If you just keep things more simple, you might get more out of it.
There's so much you can do with just knowing the duration and the RPE of a session. There's just, if you do that extremely well, you're gonna be able to do some really cool things from a monitoring standpoint, in my opinion. And I've had success with that, and I recommend most people start with that before they start to take it off into the wearable stuff. But as far as training response goes, how you respond subjectively, like you can do a wellness questionnaire. There's a million out there. Resting heart rate in the morning, waking up and seeing what that's like. If you want to get a little more advanced, you can get into the HRV stuff. But again, like I think just a subjective marker of how you're feeling following a day of training. And then, when it comes to training response and how you are responding to training, I think knowing where you are in the grand scheme of the cycle or in the annual plan, because there's going to be times during your cycle where you're supposed to be overreached and your subjective markers aren't going to be great. Your HRV is not going to be great. Your resting heart rate is not going to be great. What you don't want to happen is have those things trending negatively during a time when they're supposed to be trending positively.
Right.
So just finding out, knowing you're matching the response to what cycle you're in, I think is important. I mean, from a nutrition standpoint, I think that the bottom of the pyramid, the foundation for me is going to be caloric intake. Just making sure you're checking off that. I mean, that's just thermodynamics, calories in versus calories out. You have to have the energy to be able to perform. If you take that a step further, macronutrient breakdown, percentages there, that is probably the next biggest thing. Do micronutrients matter? 100%, yes. Does like your gut biome matter? 100%. Does timing matter? 100%. But you have to, I think, build the foundation from calories first and then move from there. It all matters though.
Yeah.
Sleep, we already talked about it from a sleep standpoint. You can use Whoop, you can use Aura. These are all great things. I've used them, but I still think you get 99.9% of the benefit from just keeping a journal, tracking when you went to bed, when you woke up, and what the quality of that sleep was. Similar to time on feet with a stopwatch, just having a record of how long you've slept and how well you slept, I think is important. And then I talked about this briefly when I was talking about what I do for training, just making sure you're tracking your KPIs. You have to have goals and you have to be able to track your progress. So just making sure you're taking good quality data and you're being consistent and you know where you are in the training process. Are you having an effect on what you're trying to elicit?
That's awesome. And so what is something that you are working on right now, whether it be personally or whether it be whether it be professionally, that you can share with us? And what are you excited about right now as far as learning or in physical pursuit?
I think right now, obviously I'm trying to be the best dad that I can be. I'm trying to be a good director of performance at work. I am trying to get a little bit better with some of the coding languages out there, working on Python and SQL. Those are some things on a personal level that I'm trying to get better at so that I can apply them to my job. So I'm constantly nagging our analytics department to come down and show me how to do certain things. So that's something that I'm trying to get better at. I got a few side projects that I'm working on that, maybe when the time is right, I'll go ahead and release it, but I don't really have anything definitive on that. Okay. Then, I think that's pretty much it. Just adding skills that are going to make me better at my job, and then trying to be the best dad that I can be.
Awesome. And if somebody wants to get in contact with you or shoot you a question, is there any way they can do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not huge on social media in terms of posting a ton, but I'm on there. I'm on Twitter a lot. I retweet a lot of things, and I like a lot of things, but I don't really tweet myself. But it's at Daniel Bove. If you want to follow me on Twitter. Instagram is also at Daniel Bove. So if you want to see crazy videos,